The wind had teeth that day, and it chewed on the edges of the silence. She stood tied to a hitching post outside the mercantile, a thing of frayed cloth and bone left to the judgment of the sun. Her feet were bare against the hardpan, the skin cracked and bleeding from a journey she did not choose. Dust, fine as milled flour, coated her black hair and settled in the hollows of her throat, a permanent thirst. Her hands were bound behind the rough-hewn cedar, the rope biting into her wrists until the feeling had long since fled, leaving a dull, wooden numbness. She kept her gaze fixed on a loose board in the porch floor, tracing its grain with her eyes, counting the knots. It was a small world to live inside, but it was hers. Looking up meant seeing the faces, and the faces were a mirror of her own degradation. They drifted past like tumbleweeds. Men in sweat-stained hats who paused to spit brown juice near her feet, their laughter a dry rattle. Women who pulled their children closer, their whispers sharp as broken glass, questions about where she came from, what she was, none of which had answers she could give. She was a curiosity, a piece of flotsam washed up on the shores of their dusty town, and soon, like any novelty, she would become boring. A thick-necked man with a voice like grinding stones was the architect of her shame. He was Barrows. He paraded his ownership, leaning against the mercantile wall, polishing an apple on his sleeve. He spoke of her as one would speak of livestock. Strong back, quiet, no trouble. He was not selling, he claimed. He was making a point about bargains kept and respect owed. A language of power she did not understand but felt in the tightening of the rope. She had learned silence was a kind of armor. It did not stop the blows, but it kept the core of her from shattering. Inside that quiet, she was not the creature tied to the post. She was a memory of rain on a tiled roof, the scent of ginger and hot steam, the weight of her mother's hand on her hair. These things were ghosts, but they were kinder company than the living. The sun climbed, bleaching the color from the sky, and she leaned her weight against the wood, a slow, draining surrender. Then, a shadow fell over her small world of splintered board. It was different from the others. It did not move on. It simply stood, a tall, lean shape that blocked the relentless sun. She did not look up. She had learned that hope was a fool's game, a hook that only pulled you higher before the drop. Silas had come to town for salt and flour, a trip he made only when the emptiness of his pantry became louder than the emptiness of his house. He had seen the small crowd from the end of the street, the familiar posture of gawking cruelty. He had meant to walk past, to fetch his supplies and retreat to the quiet ache of his ranch, the life he had curated around his grief. But he saw her, a slip of a thing no bigger than a girl, bound like an animal. He saw the dust caked on her cheekbones and the raw, chafed skin of her wrists. It was the stillness of her that caught him, a resignation so deep it looked like a kind of courage. He saw the other men, their casual brutality, and Barrows, preening like a rooster on a dung heap. He stopped. The dust settled on his worn boots. He carried whole winters in his eyes, the memory of a fever that had taken his Sarah, leaving him with nothing but the echo of her breathing in the walls of their cabin. He was a man who had made a pact with solitude, who believed he was finished with the world of men. He watched for a long time, his face a mask of weathered stone. He saw the twitch of a muscle in her jaw, the only sign she was still alive to the sting of it all. Something inside him, a thing he thought long dead and buried next to his wife, stirred. It was not pity. It was a colder, harder thing. It was recognition. He knew what it was to be staked out and left for dead by life itself. Section he moved without thought, his body deciding for him. He walked through the small cluster of onlookers, his presence parting them like water. They knew him or of him. The widower from out on the barren stretch, the man who spoke more to his mule than to people. He stopped in front of Barrows. He did not look at the girl. He looked at the man who had tied her there. His voice, when it came, was low and rusted from disuse, like a pump that needed priming. It sounded like it came from under floorboards. "How much?" Barrows laughed. A wet, unpleasant sound. "She ain't for sale, Silas. Just teaching a lesson." Silas's gaze did not waver. It was flat and heavy. He reached into the pocket of his duster, his knuckles bony and scarred from a life of hard work and harder luck. He pulled out a small leather pouch. It held the coin for the salt and flour and little else. He opened it and shook the contents into his palm. A few silver coins and a handful of copper. It was not a fortune. It was survival. He held it out. "This was a debt you were owed. Consider it paid." It was not a question. Barrows's eyes narrowed, flicking from the coins to Silas's face. He saw something there he did not want to challenge. Not anger, something more final. An indifference to consequence that was more dangerous than any rage. He grunted, a sound of contempt, but he scooped the coins from Silas's hand. The transaction was ugly, demeaning, a trade in flesh done in the light of day. But it was done. Silas turned then, and for the first time, he let his eyes rest on the girl. She still had not looked up. He drew a small, worn pocket-knife. The blade clicked open, a clean, sharp sound in the thick air. He moved behind the post, his movements economical and slow, as if not to startle a wild thing. He did not speak. He simply sawed at the thick rope. The fibers gave way with a sigh. Her hands, freed, remained behind her back for a moment, as if they had forgotten any other way to be. Then they fell to her sides, limp and pale. She swayed on her feet, the blood rushing back into her wrists with 1,000 fiery needles. He put a hand out, not to touch her, but to steady the air beside her, a gesture of intent. She caught her balance, her small frame rigid. "Come on," he said, his voice still that low rumble. He turned and started walking, not looking back to see if she followed. He knew she would. There was nowhere else for her to go. The journey back to his land was a long, silent procession. The sun beat down, and the dust lifted behind them like ghosts of all the words they did not say. He walked ahead, his stride long and even, and she followed a dozen paces behind, a small, dark shape against the vast, indifferent landscape. Her bare feet whispered against the hot earth. Each step was an act of will. He did not slow his pace for her, but he did not quicken it either. It was a pace that said, "This is the way, keep up if you can." There was a harshness to it, but also a strange kind of respect. He was not carrying her. He was allowing her to walk her own path, albeit one that led directly into his. Halfway there, where the land buckled into low, sun-scorched hills, he stopped. He unslung the canteen from his shoulder. He drank, then held it out to her without turning his head. She hesitated. Kindness was a currency she had forgotten how to trade in. It often came with a hidden price. She watched his back, the worn fabric of his shirt stretched taut over his shoulder blades. He did not retract the offer. He simply waited, his arm outstretched. Slowly, she shuffled forward. Her small, chapped hands took the heavy canteen. It was cool against her skin. She drank, the water a shock of life in her parched throat. She drank until the ache eased, then screwed the cap on and handed it back. Their fingers did not touch. He took it, slung it over his shoulder, and started walking again. The contract was unspoken, but it was being written in these small, stark gestures. Water, path to follow, nothing more. The ranch appeared as the light began to fail, a collection of low, dark buildings huddled against the vast emptiness. It was not a place of comfort. It was a place of endurance. The house was clapboard, its paint long surrendered to the sun and wind, leaving the wood a silvery, weathered gray. A barn leaned with the prevailing wind, and the fences were a patchwork of old wood and new wire, a testament to a long, losing battle against entropy. A single grave sat on a small rise behind the house, marked by a simple wooden cross. The name Sarah was carved into it, the letters softened by rain and time. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the next blow. He led her not to the main house, but to a small, adjoining room that had once been for storage. It was little more than a cell, with a narrow cot against one wall, a 3-legged stool, and a single window covered in a film of dust. But it was clean. The floor had been swept, and a thin, patched blanket was folded neatly on the cot. He lit a lantern, the hiss and bloom of light pushing the gathering dark into the corners. The light caught the exhaustion etched on her face, the deep bruises of shadow beneath her eyes. He left and returned a few minutes later with a bowl of thin stew and a heel of bread. He set it on the stool. The stew was mostly potato and broth, but it was hot. He pointed to the cot. "You sleep here." Then he went to the door that connected the small room to the rest of the house. "I don't lock doors," he said, his back to her. It was a promise, a declaration of safety more potent than any words of comfort. He pulled the door closed, leaving her alone in the quiet, lantern-lit space. She stood for a long time, just listening to the sound of his footsteps receding into the main house. She looked at the stew, steam rising from it in a fragile column. She looked at the cot, the promise of rest. She looked at the unlocked door. She ate the stew, every last drop, her hands trembling slightly. Then, she lay down on the cot, pulling the rough blanket up to her chin, and for the first time in more days than she could count, she slept without fear of what the morning would bring. The days settled into a rhythm, as quiet and steady as a slow heartbeat. Morning came with a pale, gray light that crept through the dusty windowpane. Silas would already be gone. Out with the few head of cattle he ran or mending the endless fences. He would leave a piece of dried biscuit and a cup of water for her on the stool. At first, she stayed in her small room, a ghost haunting the edges of his life. She would watch him from the window, a solitary figure moving against the stark horizon. He worked with a grim, relentless efficiency, as if trying to wear out the grief that clung to him like his own shadow. Then, one morning, she stepped outside. The air was cool and thin. She took the broom from beside the main door and began to sweep the porch. The rhythmic scrape of bristles on wood was a small, solid sound in the vast silence. She swept away the dust and the dead leaves, imposing a tiny pocket of order on the encroaching wild. When he returned at midday, he said nothing, but he noticed the clean porch. His eyes flickered to it for just a second before he went inside. The next day, she cleared the weeds from a small, fallow patch of earth near the house. It had once been a garden. A few stubborn herbs still fought for life there. Her hands, soft and unused to labor, were quickly blistered and raw, but she worked until the patch was clear. She found a rusty hoe in the barn and set about turning the soil. When Silas found her there, her face streaked with dirt and sweat, he stopped and watched her for a moment. She flinched, expecting a rebuke. He simply grunted, turned, and walked away. He returned with the hoe she had been using, its blade now sharpened to a clean, silver edge. He left it leaning against the fence post and went about his business. A week later, while searching for kindling, she came across the grave again. Sarah. The wind had scoured the name, but it was still clear. On an impulse, she picked a single, tough little prairie wildflower, a spot of defiant blue in a world of brown and gray. She laid it at the base of the wooden cross. It was a small gesture, an acknowledgement of the ghost that lived in the house with them. When Silas walked past the grave that evening, he stopped. He looked at the flower for a long time, his hand resting on the weathered wood of the cross. He did not remove it. Their lives ran in parallel lines that slowly began to curve toward each other. She started cooking for them both, her skills returning in fragments of memory. She made thin soups from the wild onions she found, and baked dense, heavy bread in the old cast-iron stove. The first loaf was a disaster, burned on the outside and raw within. She had left it on the table in shame. When he came in, he broke a piece off, chewed it thoughtfully, and said, "A little dry." He ate half of it. One evening, a cold snap descended from the north, bringing a wind that rattled the window frames. She shivered in her thin cot, the single blanket no match for the chill. The next morning, a heavy wool shawl was lying folded at the foot of her bed. It was old and smelled faintly of cedar and wood smoke. It smelled of him. She wrapped it around her shoulders, and the warmth was more than just physical. It was a shield. She began to hum sometimes as she worked in the expanding garden, quiet, fragmented melodies from a life before. The tunes were sad and beautiful, and they floated on the wind, filling the empty spaces around the ranch. Silas never commented, but she would sometimes see him pause in his work, listening, his head tilted slightly. The silence between them changed. It was no longer a heavy, awkward thing full of unspoken questions. It became a shared space, a comfortable quiet built on the foundation of routine and mutual respect. They were stitching their lives together with raw thread, creating a fragile tapestry of coexistence. The nightmares came when the moon was thin, a sliver of bone in the black sky. They were always the same. The rocking of the ship, the smell of salt and fear, the faces of men who looked at her as if she were made of meat. And Barrows, always Barrows, his voice like grinding stones, the feel of the rope on her wrists. She would wake with a gasp, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She learned to stifle the sounds, pressing her face into the thin mattress until the terror subsided. She did not want to disturb the quiet peace they had built. She did not want to be a burden. But one night the dream was worse. It was not the ship, but this small, safe room. The door was locked. She was beating against it, her knuckles raw, screaming a name she did not know, but he would not open it. She woke with a sharp cry, sitting bolt upright in the dark, the wool shawl clutched in her fists. The door to the main house creaked open. Silas stood silhouetted in the doorway, a tall, dark shape against the faint moonlight from the other room. He held no lamp. He just stood there, waiting. Her breath hitched. Fear, old and familiar, coiled in her stomach. "The door ain't locked," he said. His voice was quiet, a low rumble that cut through the ringing in her ears. He did not move closer. He did not offer comfort. He just stated a fact that was the bedrock of her new life. She stared at his shape, the outline of his shoulders, the stillness of his presence. The panic slowly receded, leaving behind a cold, trembling exhaustion. He stood there until her breathing evened out, until the frantic rhythm in her chest slowed to a steady beat. Then, without another word, he pulled the door almost closed, leaving it open just a crack, and went back to his own room. The next evening, they sat by the fire, the way they often did after the meal was done. He would oil a piece of leather or sharpen a tool, and she would mend a shirt or simply watch the flames. The silence was deep and comfortable. She broke it. Her voice was thin, hardly more than a whisper, but in the quiet room it was as loud as a shout. "Why?" He did not look up from the harness strap he was working on, but his hands stilled. He knew what she was asking, not just about the unlocked door, about all of it, the coins, the long walk, the shawl. He was silent for a long time, the fire crackling in the hearth. He seemed to be weighing his words, searching for ones that were true. "Town saw a thing to be used," he said at last, his voice rough. "I saw a person." He finally looked at her, his eyes dark and serious in the firelight. "And I needed help with the garden." A tiny smile touched her lips, the first he had ever seen. It was a fragile, fleeting thing, but it changed her whole face. It was like seeing the sun break through after a long winter. She looked down at her hands, which were now calloused and strong. She thought of the little green shoots poking through the dark earth in her garden. She thought of the warm shawl and the unlocked door. "You are either the kindest man I have met," she said softly, "or the most foolish." He considered this for a moment, then went back to his work. A faint hint of a smile touched his own mouth. "Can't I be both?" The trust between them, which had been a seedling, put down deep roots in that moment. It was no longer just about survival. It was about two broken people finding a way to piece themselves back together, using the silence and the space and the small, repeated kindnesses as their tools. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. The peace was a fragile thing, a thin pane of glass against a coming storm. They had built a sanctuary, but the world was bigger than their small patch of land. The harbinger came not as a rider on the horizon, but as a flicker of orange against the dark line of the distant hills. Silas saw it first. He was coming in from checking on a newborn calf, the lantern swinging in his hand. He stopped dead, his eyes fixed on the unnatural glow to the east. It was not the moon, it was fire, and it was on his grazing land. He said nothing to her. He simply grabbed a wet burlap sack from the rain barrel and his rifle, his movements tight and efficient. But she had seen it too from her window. She met him at the door, her face pale in the lantern light, the wool shawl clutched around her. "Stay inside," he ordered, his voice sharp. "Bolt the door." For the first time, she disobeyed. She shook her head, her dark eyes wide but steady. She held up another wet sack she had already prepared. The unspoken question hung between them. "Did you think I would hide?" He looked at her for a long second, at the fierce determination in her small frame. He saw not a victim but a partner. He gave a curt nod. Together, they ran out into the night, towards the hungry flames. The fire was not large, but it was deliberate. A line of burning grass, set to run with the wind toward his barn. They beat at the flames with the wet sacks, the smoke acrid and choking, the heat blistering their skin. They worked in a desperate, silent rhythm, two small figures battling a line of fire under a sky full of cold, indifferent stars. By the time they extinguished the last of it, they were both gasping, their faces black with soot, their clothes singed. The threat was gone, but the message was clear. It was a warning, a claim being reasserted. They did not have to wait long. 3 days later, as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the land, 3 riders appeared on the ridge. They did not approach with haste. They moved with the slow, arrogant confidence of men who believed they held all the power. Silas was on the porch, cleaning his rifle. He had been expecting them. He did not stop his work. The rhythmic click and slide of the oilcloth on metal a steady, calming sound. She came out and stood in the doorway behind him, a silent shadow. She was holding a heavy cast iron skillet, her knuckles white around the handle. The riders reined in at the edge of his yard. Barrows was in the lead, his face smug. He had brought 2 hired men with him, rough-looking drifters with cruel eyes. "Silas," Barrows called out, his voice dripping with false friendliness. "Came to collect what's mine." Silas finished his work on the rifle, setting the pieces back together with deliberate care. He did not raise it. He leaned it against the wall beside him. He stood up, his tall frame blocking the doorway. "You were paid," Silas said, his voice level. "She's not yours." Barrows laughed, a sound that curdled the quiet evening air. "A few coins for my trouble. That wasn't a sale. That was you paying a fine for interfering. By the law, she's my property, indentured, and I'm here to take her back." "There's no law out here but what a man makes for himself," Silas replied, his voice still unervingly calm. "And on my land, people are not property. You're not welcome here. Leave." Barrows's face hardened. "I ain't leaving without her." He nodded to his men, who began to dismount, their hands resting on the pistols at their hips. This was the moment, the breaking point. The world held its breath. The wind died down. The only sound was the creak of saddle leather. Silas did not move. He simply stood his ground, a bulwark of quiet defiance. He was one man and they were 3. The odds were poor. He knew it. Barrows knew it. Then a small movement. She stepped out from behind Silas, moving to stand beside him. She did not cower. She raised the heavy skillet, its black iron looking like a primitive shield. Her face was grim, her eyes burning with a fire that matched the one they had fought days before. And she spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the tension with absolute clarity. It was a single word, spoken in her own language first, a sound like a sharp stone. Then, in English, so there could be no mistake. "No." Barrows stared, genuinely taken aback. He had seen her as an object, a mute creature to be owned and used. To see her stand there, to hear her speak with such defiance, it broke the frame of his world. For a second, he was faced not with property, but with a person. A person who was ready to fight. One of his men snickered. Look at that. Got some fight in her after all. He took a step forward. Silas's hand moved then, not to his rifle, but to the wood axe that was propped against the porch rail. He hefted it, the weight familiar and balanced in his hand. He didn't raise it to threaten. He just held it. First man who takes another step, Silas said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet, loses a foot. There was no bluster in his tone. It was a simple statement of fact, a promise of swift and brutal consequence. The drifter hesitated, looking from Silas's cold eyes to the heavy axe and back again. He was being paid, but maybe not enough for that. Barrows, seeing his advantage crumble, sputtered with rage. This ain't over, Silas. The whole town knows she's mine. You can't just... He ain't alone. The voice came from the side. Another figure had appeared, walking up from the direction of the neighboring ranch. It was Mr. Henderson, an old, wiry farmer Silas had shared little more than curt nods with for years. He held an ancient-looking shotgun cradled in his arms. His wife, a stern-faced woman, stood on their own porch in the distance, watching. Barrows stared at Henderson, his mouth agape. The balance of power had shifted irrevocably. It was no longer 3 against 1. It was something else. It was a community, however reluctant, drawing a line in the dust. Barrows looked from Silas's axe to Henderson's shotgun to the girl's iron skillet. He saw 3 faces united against him. He was a bully, and like most bullies, his courage was a fragile thing. With a curse, he spat on the ground, hauled himself back onto his horse, and wheeled the animal around. This place is cursed, he snarled, glaring at them all. His men, looking relieved, scrambled back onto their own mounts. They galloped away, their retreat kicking up a cloud of angry dust that slowly settled back onto the quiet land. The silence that descended was profound. It was the silence of a battle won, of a storm that had broken and passed. Henderson gave Silas a single, sharp nod, then turned and walked back toward his own property. No words were needed. Silas let the axe rest against the porch again. His shoulders, which had been rigid with tension, slumped slightly. He turned and looked at her. Her arms were trembling from the weight of the skillet, but she still held it up. He reached out and gently took it from her hands, his fingers brushing against hers. It was the first time they had truly touched. His hand was rough and calloused. Hers was small but strong. He set the skillet down. Then he put his hand on her shoulder. A simple, solid weight. A gesture of anchor and affirmation. You didn't run, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. She looked up at him, her dark eyes reflecting the last light of the setting sun. This is home, she whispered. That night, the fire in the hearth seemed to burn brighter. The quiet in the house was not one of solitude, but of shared peace. The unspoken contract, forged in silence and work, had been sealed in fire and defiance. A week passed. The land began to heal from the fire, new shoots of green pushing through the black scars. The world seemed to have tilted on its axis and settled into a new, more stable alignment. The threat was gone, and in its place, something new had begun to grow. One evening, as they sat by the fire, he spoke into the comfortable silence. I don't know your name. She looked up from the shirt she was mending. She had never offered one. The names she had been given were chains, brands of ownership she had shed with her old life. The name of her childhood was a ghost, belonging to a girl who no longer existed. I do not have one, she said softly. Silas considered this. He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her face, the resilience in her eyes. He saw the woman who had faced down Barrows with an iron skillet, the woman who had brought his dead garden back to life, the woman who had placed a flower on his wife's grave. Lena, he said, the name tasting strange and familiar on his tongue. My mother's name was Lena. It means light. He offered it to her not as a command, but as a gift, a new beginning. She tested the sound of it on her own lips, a soft whisper. Lena felt clean, felt strong, felt like her own. She looked at him, and for the second time she smiled. This time it was not fragile. It was full and bright, and it lit up the room. Lena, she repeated, a quiet declaration. I am Lena. The next morning, they took the tattered, filthy clothes she had arrived in, the rags she had been tied to the post with, and they built a small, clean fire outside. They watched as the flames consumed the fabric, turning the memory of her humiliation into gray ash that the wind carried away. It was a funeral for the girl who had no name, and a christening for the woman who did. They began to rebuild. Not just the burned patch of land, but the house itself. Together, they repaired the leaning fence, their hands working in easy tandem. He taught her how to mix whitewash, and she painted the walls of her small room, covering the dingy wood with a clean, bright white. The light poured in through the newly washed window, and the room was no longer a cell, but a sanctuary. He cleared out the room that had belonged to Sarah. For years, it had been a shrine, untouched, thick with the dust of his grief. He packed her things away carefully into a cedar chest, not erasing the memory, but making space for life to continue alongside it. One day, Lena hung a string of dried herbs and flowers on the wall of the main room, a splash of color and life against the plain wood. The house, which had been a hollow shell of memory, began to breathe again. It began to feel like a home. The ghosts were still there, but they were no longer howling. They were quiet, making room. Winter arrived, blanketing the land in a deep, cleansing snow. The world grew quiet and still. The hardships were immense, the cold a constant battle. But for the first time in years, Silas did not face it alone. They shared meals of preserved vegetables from her garden and the salted meat he had prepared. They sat by the fire, the silence between them a warm, thick blanket. The final image of their beginning was not one of passion or grand declaration. It was simple. It was a cold afternoon, the sky the color of slate, the snow falling in thick, silent flakes. They sat together on the porch, wrapped in heavy blankets, watching the world turn white. He was whittling a small bird from a piece of scrap wood. She was leaning her head against the porch post, her eyes closed, a look of profound peace on her face. He finished the bird, its wooden wings smooth and perfect under his calloused thumb. He held it out to her. She opened her eyes and took it, her small hand closing around the gift. She leaned her head, just slightly, until her shoulder rested against his. He did not flinch or pull away. He simply continued to watch the snow fall, the small, carved bird held safely in her hand. The two of them a small island of warmth in the vast, cold silence. The house behind them was no longer empty. It was full. This story, it is not just about a rescue. It is about two people who were lost in different kinds of wilderness, finding a map in each other's eyes. It's a story about how the quietest acts, a shared meal, a sharpened hoe, an unlocked door, can be louder than any shout. It's about how real strength is not the power to own, but the courage to protect. How real love is not a passionate fire, but a steady warmth that gets you through the winter. We all carry a name that was given to us by a world that wants to define us, to put us in a box, to tie us to a post. But there is another name, a true name, waiting inside us. It's the name we earn when we stand up, when we refuse to be property, when we claim our own story. And sometimes, if you are very brave and very lucky, you might find another soul out there in the wilderness who sees that true name in you and is willing to stand with you while you learn how to speak it aloud. You might find that home is not a place you are given, but a thing you build, together with silence and trust, and 2 cups of water on a long, dusty road.